Carol Reed's The Third Man is often called one of the greatest movies ever, but why? Let me help you understand why it might be good, why you might appreciate it more if you watch it again, coming up next. The Third Man is a great film noir in a classical tradition in the world of detective fiction. This is a movie that is, in one sense, practical about historical period, which is a very interesting period right after World War II, but it's also heavily theological, and that's what I want to get into. Now, whether you love this movie, hate it, or indifferent to it, you've got to respect the fact that there are a number of famous things from this movie. Now, I've got to spoil things, but that's what this video is going to do, talk about the ending and the middle and all that. Some of the most famous things from this movie include the zither score, which was a big international hit when this movie came out. Also, the cityscape itself. This is a bombed out Vienna, sort of post-apocalyptic, literally after an apocalypse or big change, World War II. The city's been destroyed, and this city's split into 5 parts, 4 quadrants, and then an international zone, as we're told at the beginning of the movie. Very interesting looking movie with lots of tilted shots, also called Dutch tilts or oblique shots. Very interesting looking movie, and dark, deep, Gothic, and so on. But the two things people do remember and talk about from this movie, you'll see quoted umpteen thousand times in movie history after this point. One is Orson Welles, who shows up in this movie as the third man, Harry Lime, the friend who everyone thinks is killed. First they think it's an accident, Holly Martins thinks it's an accident, and then he thinks it's a murder, but Orson Welles, as Harry Lime, shows up, resurrected from the dead, as it were. It's a fake death and resurrection. About an hour into the movie, one of the most, if not the most, famous movie entrances ever. Probably only Welles himself could pull this off. The look on his face is magical, amazing, captures this character who's not in the movie very long, but is very important to the ideas and concepts in this movie, captures it so well. The second thing that is super famous, quoted throughout movie history, is the last shot of the movie, where the Holly Martins character stands off to the side, and then the woman, Anna, walks right by him. It takes about a minute or maybe 2 minutes for her to do this. This is a shot actually repeated from the beginning of the movie where they were at the graveyard the first time, and you see the car with the British police chief and Holly Martins go by, and then you see Anna walking where the car goes by her. That happens the second time at the ending of the movie. Now, this is a noir featuring 2 great American types. One is the American doofus figure, sort of a doofus, Holly Martins, a naive American who shows up happy and penniless, we are told, in Vienna. He's going to get a job from his friend Harry Lime. He ends up becoming an amateur private detective, and I think if you watch this movie carefully, he really causes a lot of trouble, even though he's trying to figure out who done it and to get justice on behalf of his friend who he thinks has been killed and help out Anna Schmidt. He actually gives away too much information to the wrong people sometimes, and he ends up getting people killed, literally. He's not a very smart person. He tends to be an alcoholic. Of course, he's a writer of, and this is Green's criticism, a writer of cheap pulp novels, American Westerns, which are not very literary. It's ironic that he ends up going to speak at a literary society in the middle of the movie. Holly Martins is one American type. The second is the Orson Welles character of Harry Lime, who's a conniving international trader. Here he is a racketeer, as he's called in the movie. He's sort of a semi-capitalist. He's a shady figure. He's a man of the world. And he's very wise and clever, supposedly, at least in his own little niche, which is to be on the black market and to sell cheap drugs to people. So you have these 2 types, and they're coming together in this movie, being shown in an expat setting, which is Vienna in this case. The classic American in Europe, and the question of what's the difference between Americans and Europeans comes up in this movie, as it has in the last 100+ years of literary history. Now, this video could easily be about an hour or 2 hours of discussion. I want to focus just on the title, although I'd love to talk about each of the characters and all kinds of other things in this movie. The title, what does the title of The Third Man mean? Very interesting answers to this question. Now, practically speaking, it comes from the plot.
3 men helped to carry your friend to the statue.
Kurtz?
Yes?
The Romanian?
Yes?
And
There was a third man.
The third man is the third man witnessed at the scene of the murder. The characters know who the two of the men are, but they don't know who the third man is. There seems to be an unnamed person who didn't give information to the police, and so Holly Martins is looking for this third man. He does end up finding him because the third man literally is the Orson Welles character of Harry Lime, and apparently Of course, he hasn't died. He's faked his own death and someone else has died in his place. So he is then the third man. But now here's where I want to get theological. And you got to remember, the script is by Graham Greene, a very famous and excellent British novelist, also a film critic too. Read his whole series of novels. He's got many, many great novels. I'm a big fan of his. But he wrote the screenplays, he did a couple of others, and the third man is coming out of Catholic theology, Christian theology in general. At least that's one way to interpret this. If you go to 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, the third man is, well, not mentioned there, but there's hints that there could be a third man, or this movie is riffing on 1 Corinthians 13, when we're told that Adam, as in the Adam and Eve story in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, is the first man. He is the first created human being. Thus his name, Adam, means man. And so he is a created being of the natural world, as it says in the Bible. And he, of course, sins. He breaks God's one law, which is not to eat of the tree. And then decay and sin and death happen. And death becomes the master of humanity. It literally obliterates everything in creation after that. Things die, human beings die, and so on. At least that's one way to read Genesis, possibly. But then in that same 1 Corinthians 15 passage, you have the second man, who is Jesus Christ from heaven. He's a spirit who comes to earth, or he's God on earth, and he comes to earth and he restores humanity to itself. He saves humanity of its sins and restores what the old Adam, the first Adam, lost. So thus the first man is Adam, the second man, Jesus Christ, in terms of the Apostle Paul, both in the book of Romans and 1 Corinthians. So we have first man, second man, but third man. So who is the third man? Is he a step beyond the second man, Jesus Christ? Is he something new? Is he a positive development? Of course, no. The third man is Harry Lime, who's very nasty in buying and selling drugs, diluting drugs in the black market, and harming people, including children, with his nefarious black market dealings, and he doesn't care. So one of the keys to this movie is the Ferris wheel scene. Very famous, the whole thing, including Orson Welles' speech right at the end of the scene with the Ferris wheel, where he talks about the Italians versus the Swiss and who is great and who's not, and war and violence might create greatness, whereas peace and love don't. That's one of the ideas in his famous speech.
In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock.
But on this wheel, I think this scene is absolutely amazing. He talks from his third man perspective of being above everybody else. He takes Mertens above the whole city, looks down on it as a god would look down on human beings, or as a higher authority or higher creature would on lower creatures. And he basically says, or he asks a question, but he basically says, human lives aren't worth anything, and an individual human is not even a human, it's a dot on a map, or a data point, if you want to think about things that way. And how much would you pay to obliterate a dot? Well, from a perspective of God or high up on the wheel, a dot is nothing and meaningless. And if there are thousands or tens of thousands of dots, okay, that's a lot, but in terms of billions of people, what are 10,000?
Look down there. Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever? If I offered you 20,000 pounds for every dot that stopped, would you really, old man, tell me to keep my money? Or would you calculate how many dots you could afford to spend? Free of income tax, old man. Free of income tax.
Maybe he's a utilitarian. Maybe he's just amoral. He's rationalizing what he's done with the drugs in the black market. And he's out for himself. He's out to profit for himself. And he's taking care of himself. He didn't care about anybody in the movie but himself, and getting away with his crimes. So the point of view and the perspective of the third man is human beings are worthless. Their individual life is worthless. This comes straight out of, for example, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment novel, and a number of other things, but that one's a famous one, in which the character of Raskolnikov rationalizes that taking out an old woman will not hurt him and not hurt anybody in the world because she's meaningless and worth nothing to civilization, to life. And so he goes ahead, and this is not a spoiler for Crime and Punishment, murders her. Well, this is sort of Harry Lime's, I think, his point of view. And so this is a new way of thinking, an amoral, if you want to call it that, way of thinking in the 20th century that Greene is calling out, and he does throughout his entire fiction.
I'm just a little mixed up about things in general. Nobody thinks in terms of human beings. Governments don't. Why should we? They talk about the people and the proletariat. I talk about the suckers and the mugs. It's the same thing.
Orson Welles plays this character to perfection. The contrast with him is Martin's, who played to perfection, I think, by Joseph Cotton, the naive, bumbling, would-be detective figure who doesn't know what he's stumbling into until he runs into Harry Lime's amorality. But to deal with these sort of amoral international capitalists, these figures of commerce who think they have great power and would do anything to us if they could, that's a little worrisome, and that's a phenomenon probably Green is calling out, I think, in the script. So to me, one of the greatest shots in the movie is when Harry Lime, going through the sewer, is shot, and then he tries to get out onto the earth, but he can't. He is a man of the sewers, of the underworld. He thinks he's a man of the overworld, looking down on all humanity, literally looking down on them by taking them out with his crimes and his dealings, but he lives underground. Again, a Dostoevsky reference, Notes from Underground, that great short novel from Dostoevsky. And Lime dies in the sewer trying to get up out of the sewer grate. Just listen to this scene, for example. You hear the wind, and then the fingers try to get out, and Lime tries to get out onto the earth, which is where Adam was born, the first man. He's a man of the world. And you hear the wind, the spirit, which could be the Holy Spirit or could be the winds of change, whatever, but not even Lime can get up and experience that wind, which is life-giving, perhaps, if you want to think of it in terms of spirits. And so, what is the third man? He's a man of the underworld. He's a sewer rat. He's a pathetic creature who believes he's the lord of everybody, and yet is kind of the scum of the earth in that ironically called sweet-smelling sewer of Vienna. All of these ideas, if you take them to be real and in the movie, are only amplified by Carol Reed's wonderful choices. So many angular shots, excellent shots of bombed out places or empty areas of life. And this movie, when Harry Lime is going to be caught by the police or chased by the police, quotes the great Fritz Lang movie M, in which a balloon salesman who's blind is able to catch a murderer, actually a child serial killer in that movie. And that balloon salesman shows up here 18 years after M in this movie. Maybe it likened Harry Lime to the serial killer in M, and I think there's some parallels there with both of them. They kind of even look alike, that Peter Lorre character and Orson Welles character. So check out my video on M. I think these two movies are of a piece in talking about some of the dilemmas of the 20th century, and especially urban life. And now in 1949, life after World War II. What I've just talked about is only a sliver of what we can discuss in this great, great, great movie. Go ahead in the comments and give your ideas, your interpretations, what you love about this movie. I'd really like to hear from you all. I think this movie is still great and relevant. I think it's one of the great movies ever. Certainly one of the great noirs ever, because noir is so powerful. I think it's one of the great movies ever, is one of the great noirs ever. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for more great content. Have a great day.